We look at killers to understand the darkness, to peer into lives that should terrify us, but instead fascinate. Why else would serial killers get love letters in prison? There's a strange pull in the smile of a murderer, in the quiet words of someone who's taken lives. We take comfort in the belief that monsters are easy to spot. That evil looks like a mask or a shadow in the corner, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes evil wears a charming grin. Sometimes it wins fan mail, marriage proposals, and adoring crowds. Sometimes it earns nothing but disgust. Because the truth is, society doesn't react to killers the same way. Some are reviled, cursed, and remembered only for their cruelty. Others disturbingly become icons, warped celebrities of crime. This isn't about glorification. It's about the unsettling line between fear and fascination. About why some killers are despised and why others are disturbingly adored. So today, we explore these extremes. The serial killers who are most hated, and the ones against all reason who are most loved. Let's begin. We expect monsters to be shunned, locked away, despised, and erased from memory. But some killers never fade. Instead, they become legends, twisted celebrities with admirers who ignore the horror and embrace the myth. These are the stories of those whose crimes repulsed the world, yet whose names drew letters, proposals, and fascination long after the blood had dried. Ted Bundy. He was handsome, intelligent, charming, and behind it all, he was a predator. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy roamed across Washington, Oregon, Colorado, Utah, and Florida, leaving a trail of terror in his wake. He targeted young women, approaching them with fake injuries or police disguises, luring them into his car, and then disappearing into the night. Officially, he admitted to 28 murders. Some say the real number may have been in the hundreds. Bundy had grown up shy, bullied, and uneasy at home. But by the time he reached college, he had transformed. His intelligence and confidence disguised a darkness no one suspected. To friends and lovers, he was attentive and articulate. To his victims, he was death itself. Convicted of multiple murders, including that of a 12-year-old girl, Bundy was sentenced to death. His trial became a spectacle, broadcast across America. He defended himself in court, smiled for the cameras, and somehow turned even his final days into theater. And disturbingly, he was adored. Women lined up at his hearings, some convinced of his innocence, others simply captivated by his looks and charm. Bundy received fan mail and even married in prison. When the switch was thrown in Florida's electric chair in 1989, hundreds gathered outside chanting, "Burn Bundy, burn." Yet even as flames of justice rose, his twisted celebrity never really died. Richard Ramirez. Where Bundy was polished, Ramirez was chaos. He wasn't the boy next door predator. He was the nightmare in the shadows. Born in El Paso, Texas, Richard Ramirez's childhood was soaked in violence. At 12, he watched his cousin, a Vietnam veteran, brag about raping and killing women overseas. Soon after, Ramirez witnessed that same cousin murder his wife. Those moments etched themselves deep into the boy's mind, pulling him into a spiral of burglary, drugs, and darkness. By 1984, Ramirez had become the Night Stalker. His killings began with the rape and stabbing of a 79-year-old widow and escalated into a spree of home invasions across Los Angeles. Victims were assaulted, beaten, and murdered. Satanic symbols marked the crime scenes, adding to the terror. For a year, the city lived in fear. Gun sales skyrocketed. Windows were locked. Strangers' footsteps became nightmares in the making. When his face hit the newspapers in 1985, his reign of terror collapsed in a frenzy. A mob of citizens recognized him, chased him down, and beat him until police arrived. He was convicted of 13 murders and sentenced to death. Yet prison didn't erase him, it amplified him. Women flocked to his trial, drawn not by his crimes but by his dark charisma. In fact, he married Doreen Leoy, one of the women on the jury in California's San Quentin State Prison while on death row. Jeffrey Dahmer. Some killers horrify, others confuse. Jeffrey Dahmer did both. His story began in 1978 when an 18-year-old drifter in Ohio became his first victim. Then, nearly a decade of silence. But when Dahmer returned to killing in 1987, he didn't stop. Over the next 5 years, he lured young men, mostly poor, often minorities, into his Milwaukee apartment. There, the nightmare unfolded. 15 boys and men were murdered. Many were mutilated. Some were kept. His crimes crossed boundaries most couldn't even imagine: necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. By the time police finally caught him in 1991, the details of what he had done shook America to its core. In 1992, Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life terms, with a 16th added for his very first murder. But prison was not the end. 2 years later, another inmate beat him to death, leaving his legacy sealed in blood. And yet, Dahmer became one of the most infamous dark celebrities in history. Books were written, documentaries dissected his crimes. And decades later, Netflix turned his story into a much-acclaimed series. For some, the series was a disturbing attempt to glamorize horror. For others, it only fueled fascination, giving Dahmer the twisted immortality that many believe he never deserved. Charles Manson. Some killers wield knives. Charles Manson wielded people. His story wasn't one of lone attacks in the dark. It was something more terrifying: control. In the summer of 1969, Los Angeles learned just how dangerous that control could be. On August 9th, actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, was butchered in her home along with Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Fiarski, and Stephen Parent. The next night, wealthy couple Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were stabbed to death. In 2 nights, 7 people were slaughtered under Manson's orders. Blood covered the walls, the word pig smeared in red. Helter Skelter scrawled as a prophecy of chaos. Manson never held the knife in those killings. He didn't have to. His family of followers did it for him. Their loyalty turned his apocalyptic visions into reality, making him the dark shepherd of death. Later, Manson admitted to more. In recordings, he spoke of killings in Mexico, boasting of dead men left on beaches. "I'd kill you all if I had the chance," he once said. Convicted in 1971, his death sentence was later commuted to life. He would die behind bars in 2017, denied parole a dozen times. His shadow never left. Books like Helter Skelter became bestsellers. Films and documentaries retold his story. His wild eyes, his rambling interviews, his bizarre charisma. Manson became a cult figure to some, a symbol of pure evil to others. Jack Unterweger. Killers tend to hide in shadows, but Jack Unterweger wore a mask of culture and sophistication, convincing an entire nation that he had transformed from a murderer into a reformed man of letters, when in truth, his darkness had only grown sharper. Born in Austria in 1950, abandoned by his mother and raised by an abusive grandfather, Unterweger's youth was marked by crime and cruelty. By his teens, he was already assaulting sex workers. In 1976, he was convicted of strangling 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer with her own bra. Sentenced to life, most assumed his story would end behind prison walls. But prison didn't silence him. He learned to write, producing an autobiography that became a bestseller. Intellectuals and artists rallied behind him, praising his supposed rehabilitation. In 1990, their influence helped secure his parole. To the public, he was a walking miracle, a killer turned literary star. On the outside, Unterweger thrived in the spotlight. He toured, spoke on television, and even worked as a journalist, writing about the very murders he was committing. Prostitutes across Europe and Los Angeles were found strangled in the same brutal way as his first victim. He used his charm and reputation to shield himself, perfect wolf in plain sight. In 1992, investigators finally closed in. Even as he stood trial, Unterweger played the role of the misunderstood artist, insisting on his innocence. But the evidence was undeniable. In 1994, he was convicted of 9 murders, though many believe the true count was higher. Hours after sentencing, he proved his final deception. Using the drawstring of his prison uniform, he hanged himself in his cell. The man once celebrated as proof of redemption died as what he always was, a predator cloaked in art and lies. While some serial killers gain a dark sort of infamy, others are universally reviled for the sheer brutality of their crimes. These figures are remembered not for mystery or charisma, but for the terror and cruelty they left behind. Andre Chikatilo. Some killers hunt in the shadows. Chikatilo hunted in plain sight, hidden only by the lies of a nation. Born in Ukraine during the famine of the 1930s, his childhood was soaked in horror stories. His mother told him his brother had been kidnapped and eaten. True or not, the seed of cannibalism was planted early. By the late 1970s, Chikatilo was preying on runaways and children around train stations in Rostov. Luring them with the promises of food or safety, he turned their trust into slaughter. His victims were stabbed, mutilated, and in some cases, cannibalized. The Soviet state denied that such crimes would even exist in a communist society. That denial allowed him to keep killing, over 50 victims across a decade of terror. Whole towns lived in fear, watching children vanish at bus stops. When police finally closed in, Chikatilo confessed in chilling detail, even walking them through his killing grounds. In 1994, he was executed with a single bullet to the head, but to many in Russia, his crime symbolized something darker: the rot in a system that insisted monsters like him couldn't exist. Albert Fish. Some killers terrify, but Albert Fish disgusted. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1870, Fish's childhood was scarred by abuse inside an orphanage. Whippings and humiliation warped into fantasies he carried for life. What began as self-inflicted pain twisted into sadism, cannibalism, and murder. He targeted the most vulnerable, poor children, often overlooked by society. But his most infamous crime was the abduction of 11-year-old Grace Budd. Posing as a kindly benefactor, he lured her from her home. Years later, Grace's parents received a horrifying letter in Fish's own hand, describing how he killed and ate parts of their daughter. His confession stretched beyond imagination. Mutilations, castrations, crimes that blurred the line between madness and evil. The newspapers called him the Gray Man and the Brooklyn Vampire. In 1935, a jury convicted him of Grace Budd's murder. Some jurors believed he was insane, but still chose execution. When the switch was thrown at Sing Sing prison in 1936, the man who fed on fear and flesh was finally silenced. John Wayne Gacy. Have you heard of the Killer Clown? By day, he was the friendly contractor, the neighbor who hosted big barbecues, the clown who entertained the children's parties. By night, he was luring boys into his Chicago home, promising jobs, drinks, or a place to stay. Once inside, he had a ritual, a magic trick with handcuffs, a sudden shift into terror. Victims were raped, strangled, and stuffed into the crawl space beneath his suburban home. For years, the stench rose from the earth. He brushed it off as dampness. But in 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peast led police straight to Gacy. A search revealed a nightmare buried in dirt. 29 bodies crammed beneath his floorboards, 4 more dumped in rivers. The world was horrified. The killer clown had murdered 33 young men and boys, hiding behind painted smiles and neighborly charm. Convicted in 1980 and executed by lethal injection in 1994, Gacy left behind one of the most grotesque stories in American crime. Pedro Lopez, the monster of the Andes, is remembered with pure hatred. Moving silently through Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, he preyed on the most innocent, young girls who trusted him. Once he gained their trust, he lured them away with promises of gifts or work. What followed was unspeakable. One after another, his victims vanished. In 1980, police finally caught him, and the horror unraveled. Graves of more than 50 children were uncovered. Lopez admitted to killing over 300, detailing the murders with chilling calm. Convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador, he spent less than 20 years behind bars. In 1998, he walked free, rewarded with good behavior. Since then, he has disappeared. His whereabouts are unknown, but his legacy is certain. Pedro Lopez is not just hated. He's a reminder of how evil can slip through cracks in justice and haunt entire nations. Evil takes many faces. Some killers are dissected endlessly in books, shows, and documentaries. Others are remembered only for the horror they left behind. But fascination or hatred, the truth remains the same. These stories linger because they expose something we'd rather not face. Monsters exist. Sometimes they wear the most ordinary disguise.